Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Anand Chowdhary, and I am going to talk about how to open source as a startup. So I am a maintainer and a founder. I'm a GitHub star for the second year in a row, and I've also built a few technology-focused companies. So what I try to do is combine open source with entrepreneurship. Today I'm going to talk about three things. My open source project that became a software as a service company, what I'm up to right now, and you won't believe it, it's completely unrelated to tech, and encouraging maintainers to become founders. So let's get started with my open source project to SaaS journey. So my open source journey starts in 2016, 8 years after I published my first website. So I published my first site on the internet when I was 10 years old, and I was on GitHub. Next week, it's going to be 10 years that I've been on GitHub. So it's like mind-blowing for me personally that I've been. The thing is, while I was growing up, all of the code I was writing, I would put on GitHub just as a public repository. But in 2016, I actually built my first, what you would call an open source project, right, with contributors and a healthy community. And how it got started was that I was working as a consultant for a bunch of e-commerce companies. And while I was working with them, I noticed that a lot of their websites were not very accessible for people with disabilities. This means that people with disabilities would have trouble using their site. And I would make the case that this is not just for it's the right thing to do, this is a business decision. You want to make your sites really accessible. And it just happened to be that I was participating in the Angel Hack Hackathon right that weekend. And I thought, okay, so I can work with all of my clients to make their sites more accessible, but what if I could build something that would add accessibility features to any website that you're on? So at that weekend hackathon, I ended up building Oswald for Chrome, which is a browser extension that helps you read more easily on the web. So in 24 hours, we built a quick project, and we won the Code for Impact Challenge at Angel Hack. And how it works is really simple. So this is Wikipedia, right? And you can see that you can read an article here. And on the top right, you can click on the plugin, and it would say Oswald is disabled. And you have the option to enable it, really simply. As soon as you press this button, Wikipedia would be redesigned in a way that is more easily readable for you. So for me personally, it could be that I find white and black high contrast too much, so I change it to yellow on black. It could be that I want the font much bigger to make it more easily readable, so you can see that the fonts are much bigger. You would also notice that there is more space between each letter, each word, and each line. So you can press on preferences, and you can customize your reading experience. So with Oswald for Chrome, you can say, I have a learning disability like dyslexia, or I wear specs, so I want a bigger font size. And you can see a live preview on the right, and you can select everything from the colors to the fonts to space between everything. And you can really personalize your reading experience, and it would be applied across the web. So that's the whole story, right? Go to a weekend hackathon, build a cool project, put it up on GitHub, MIT licensed, and people use it a bit. And then that was it. I went to design school. And because I always kind of fancied myself as a designer and engineer, so I thought, hey, I'm going to enjoy design school. And in my second week in design school, I got an email from a therapist who works with children with disabilities in New York. And she sent me this email. She said, I love it. I work with children with disabilities, and I also use visual modifications myself. And your extension is the best out there. And I was like mind blown. I was like, okay, wait, so I made something in like a weekend hackathon, and a real therapist is using this with real kids, and she's telling me that it's the best product she's used in this space. That means someone has to work harder in this space. And I thought, okay, I have the opportunity, so let me see what I can do. And when I was looking through the deck, I found a review that really summarizes how I was thinking. So this is Adnan's review on the Chrome Web Store. And he said that he has photophobia, which is a condition where your eye doesn't like very high contrast. It's because your cornea lets in some light, and then you get a bunch of irritation. And he says that the default, which is black text on a white background, which is just how the web is designed, is too high contrast. And he is not able to use the web easily. And he says that the plugin literally changed his life. And I was like, okay, now it's too much for me to handle. So I was, of course, very grateful that he said, thank you for keeping it free. But I thought I should be doing more. Because if it's genuinely true that real people have problems that can be solved in something that you build in a couple of hours at a hackathon, it's almost your moral responsibility to do more. So I called my mom and I said, I want to drop out of design school and I want to come back home and I want to work on this full time. And so I did that. So from this review, I thought, okay, so what people are telling me is that they want a personalized experience when they're reading on the web and in general. And it would be really nice if we can keep it free. So that I came up with this idea that, okay, what if we could make accessibility available as a feature everywhere, and we could make it free for consumers, but we can build a business around it by charging companies who can afford to pay. So the idea was, okay, so if we have a browser extension, the idea was then each website doesn't have to work super hard to add customization because you have a browser extension, but then you have to install it. So I thought, okay, let's go one level down. What if we could add this as a feature on all websites? So it came up with the idea that, okay, we can build an online platform for accessibility. And then we can go one step down. What if we could implement all of this technology on the device itself? Then everything that you read on your entire computer would be accessible for you based on your personal reading preferences. So we started with the device, and we started with the smartphone, and we built a smartphone. So how it worked was that you would buy a smartphone, and it would have a really simple user interface, just 6 buttons. And how we designed it was that imagine you are a farmer in rural India, and you cannot read. What you can do is know that if I press on the thing that looks like a newspaper, my phone is going to read out the news to me in my native language. And how it worked for people with disabilities is, for example, I invented a technology with which people who are partially or completely visually impaired can actually feel vibrations in their hand and get audio feedback to use a smartphone really easily. So we built a smartphone. Under the hood, how it worked is there was an Android phone, and we built a custom ROM on top of Android. Back then it was Android 5. And we added a bunch of stuff like our speech and vibration technology, an accessible user interface, and all of these customization features that everything was built on top of. The problem was and I did this actually, when I would go to a blind relief organization or a nonprofit or a blind school, I would say, you can use a smartphone for the first time really easily. All you need to do is buy an Android smartphone, get root access to it, install CyanogenMod, learn how to break the kernel, and then install our custom ROM. And that was not a very good pitch. So we thought, okay, what if you could install all of our tech in any smartphone? So we ended up building apps. For example, Augmently is an AR reading app that helps kids with dyslexia read more easily. So how it works is you have a textbook, you take a photo of the book, and you can see the text in real time in AR, but in a dyslexia-friendly reading format. We worked with some students, and we published a research paper in the IEEE that shows that kids with dyslexia could actually read 20% faster with our app. We also built live subtitles, which is, as it sounds, subtitles for real life. So imagine if you're hearing impaired, you're watching a movie, you can read the subtitles. What if you are having a conversation and you can point your smartphone and you can get the subtitles? Really simple. And we also built Visibly, which is an app that helps people who are blind just walk around with live audio feedback. So it would say, there's a tree in 5 meters, or this is the currency note that you're looking at right now, and so on. So the last two are progressive web apps, and the first one is available on iPhone and Android. And this is how we started building the company. On the other side, we thought, okay, now if we want to build a business around it, we would target institutions like enterprises and governments, and we built our web accessibility platform. So this is not an accessibility overlay. Any product that tells you that add our product and you will become accessible is lying to you. What it is a customization platform. It helps you add a set of features with which people can customize your website to their reading preferences. And it also integrates with your help desk or your live chat and all the tools. So it's almost like one platform to help people use your site more easily. So we work with, for example, the government of India's program, Startup India. If you go to their site, startupindia.gov.in, you can use our plugin. So we work now with enterprises and governments to add all of this technology built in. And we built on top of it with a product called Daily, which is basically a robot that would go to your website every day, and it would check for accessibility issues, and it would tell you when there's an accessibility issue. Really simple. So that's my story from a weekend hackathon project to a software as a service company, which does a bunch of different stuff in the accessibility technology space. What am I up to these days is I, in 2020, started a new company called Fabio, which is a completely different thing. So Fabio offers rent-to-own furniture with personalized interior design in Europe. So how it works is, imagine you rent an apartment. You can take some photos of your empty apartment and you can upload them on our website, and you will receive a personalized interior design concept of what your fully furnished apartment can look like, based on your own taste and how do you want it to be. And when you're happy, you sign a contract, and we deliver, install, assemble, set up the whole place. You just have to move in there. And just like you pay the rent, you pay a monthly subscription fee for all your furniture. And at the end of your subscription, you can either pay the difference and actually own the furniture if you want to keep it, or we can take it back, refurbish it, and put it in a new apartment at a discount. So it's a circular economy with accessible interior design company. We went through Y Combinator last year, and it's been fun. We're available in Switzerland. We just launched in Berlin and Munich earlier this year. So our plan is to grow in Europe. So my friends tell me this is the least technical thing you're doing as an engineer designer, but there's a lot of really fun tech. We have our own rendering technology with all of this cool 3D renders. We also do a lot of fun warehouse logistics stuff. We can predict what kind of furniture we need to order when based on what people are looking at. But when we built the site, we have a really nice site and we have onboarding and customers are coming. I thought, I need to know if it ever goes down. I thought I need an uptime monitor and I need a status page. And there are a bunch of these options, right? There are enterprise options and there's also free options, like Uptime Robot is the most famous one. The problem with Uptime Robot is not very customizable, it's very opinionated. And I thought, hey, GitHub Actions has this new thing called scheduled workflows. So what if I could tell GitHub Actions to run a workflow every 5 minutes, and it's going to be really simple. You just do curl my site, and if it's down, it should tell me it's down, otherwise nothing, right? Really simple. And we ended up building Uptime. So how Uptime works is we have a template repository with all the GitHub Actions set up. You just have to click the Use This Template button, and you add all of your URLs, what are the sites you want to monitor. You add all the notifications, like inform me on Slack or send me an email when something goes down. And Uptime will set up your repository. So on your README, you can see a live status of your website. You can see response time graphs and historical uptime. And we use Git as a way to track historical uptime. So each commit means every time your site was up or down. And then we integrate with GitHub issues. So if anything ever goes wrong, Uptime automatically opens a GitHub issue. And you can then use that issue as incident reporting. So if you're investigating what happened, you can write a little comment. When you build a fix, you can write another comment. And as soon as your site comes back up, Uptime will close the issue and mark the incident as resolved. And then lastly, you get a really beautiful status page. So you can publish this on your own domain. You can customize the site. You can share it with your customers. And they can see all of the past incidents. They can see if the site is currently up or not. They can see all the history and so on. So again, this was a really quick idea for ourselves, and we ended up building a really fun open source project. Today, Uptime is my most popular project with 12K stars, and some of my favorite companies use Uptime in production, like authentication open source startup Ori, or Waka Time that I use for tracking coding time, or Chatwood, which is an open source live chat company, or Canonical, the people who make Ubuntu. And what's really interesting is I did this quick back of the envelope calculation that every month, almost 7,500 hours of free CI time is used just by uptime alone. And it's really interesting, so for every hour that passes in human time, 10 hours pass in uptime time. And it's all free CI minutes because on GitHub Actions, you don't have to pay if it's a public repository. So that's really cool that a lot of people are using uptime. So you can ask, how does uptime generate value for Fabio? Why would a furniture startup build an open source project that has nothing to do with it? For us, it was a few things. And I learned this from all the inbound we got. For example, people want to work at Fabio. We get basically a really great free high quality hiring pipeline because people like uptime, they use it for their personal projects, and then they say, hey, who are the people who are building this project? Who are the maintainers of this project? And then they see, okay, this is a company, YC funded, this is what they're up to, and then they say, yeah, I want to work here. It's really great. So that gives us a really nice unfair advantage to be able to hire better. It also, this is a bit personal for me, which is that it also adds authenticity as a technology company, because we do sell furniture. So all companies say that they're a tech company, but we can prove it, right? We can say this is, for example, some of the open source stuff that we've been up to these days. And most importantly, I think it builds company culture. We can ingrain this in our values that just like any other company, we are also built on top of open source. And it's our responsibility to give back to the ecosystem. And then finally, I think it also adds developer education as a free perk. Because the employees who work at your company now learn how to triage issues and how to do the stuff that maintainers usually do. And it's like a brand new skill set that they can learn and apply in other parts of the business. I was reading the 2020 FOSS contribution survey by the Linux Foundation and the Lab for Innovation Science at Harvard. And the top 3 reasons that people responded as motivations for open source contribution were, 1, adding a needed feature or fix, which makes sense, right? As developers, we like to scratch our own itch. And if there's a bug in a project or we want a new feature, a lot of times we just make a pull request. Makes sense. You enjoy learning new stuff, which also makes a lot of sense because as contribution, that's how I got started, right? Before I actually had a proper project which had a community, I was building in the open. My personal website, other stuff, I would just put it up on GitHub, and sometimes people would star it, and I would learn a lot through other projects. And lastly, which is most interesting for Fabio, is that people said that it fulfills a creative desire. People enjoy their work more when they get to do open source. So how do you get started with open source at your own company? I think the easiest is to set up an open source strategy. You can encourage contributions internally, like we do. And how do you do that? I think you can really start with the absolute minimum, right? You can take baby steps like a hackathon. You could, for example, say, if your employees want to go for a weekend hackathon, we will cover the costs. Or we can do a weekly sprint every quarter where we do a sprint week of maintaining open source projects or doing a new open source project. And what we started doing at Fabio is the third one, which is open sourcing your internal tools. So uptime for us was a quick solution that I came up with. It's almost like a hack to use GitHub Actions like this. But it's now a really popular open source project, and we built it for ourselves and ended up giving it to the world. And so I think a lot of people think about IP or defensibility, and they don't want to build their own company's stack open source, which I understand. It's a school of thought. I can respect it. But what you can do is start with non-critical components. Think side projects, but also, for example, your design system. If you make these open source, you encourage more community, you encourage a great hiring pipeline, and you don't feel like your core IP is available in an MIT license if you have problems with that, which is fine. And then lastly, for example, you can sponsor your upstream dependencies. GitHub makes it really easy for you to see what are the projects that your code base relies upon, And you can, for example, use commands like npm fund to find out what are the most popular maintainers who accept GitHub sponsorships or Patreon sponsorships. And it's almost in your vested interest to make sure that your upstream dependencies are maintained. And so another really easy way to get started with open source contribution is to sponsor your dependencies. I have another really fun example. I used to work with El Nino, which is a consulting company in Enschede. That's a city in the eastern part of the Netherlands, near the German border. And so I was consulting for the consulting company. I was like a consultant. And what I noticed was that for each of their clients, apparently, and I was really surprised, file uploading was an unsolved problem. You want to let people drag and drop or like upload files and then make sure it's compressed or whatever. And they were writing all of this code again and again. So internally, we built a product called Upload. It's a fully front-end, no back-end required file uploading widget. How it works is that you press a button, upload a file, and this widget opens up. And then you can drag and drop files. You can use the camera of your device to take a photo. You can import it from a URL, or you can search on Unsplash to find photos. You can just find the photos. You can edit them within Upload. So you can crop them, add filters, whatever. And then when you're happy, we upload it to the server. Really simple. We built it again as an internal tool so that we don't have to do file uploads again and again. And this was my first project that got 1K stars on GitHub. So it's very important to me. And we also launched it on Product Hunt. It was the #1 product. So again, digital agency, nothing to do with open source, built a project to scratch their own itch, but ended up doing something better for the whole ecosystem by making an open source project. So when you're getting started with open source at your company, whenever I, for example, talk to my friends who are maintainers, who work at real companies, they say, I say, how do you find the time to do all of this great open source work? And it's like, I do it on the weekend, or I do it at night when I go home, or whatever. So I think there are these anti-patterns that may already exist in your company. I don't think you should have to take lunch or nights or weekends to do open source. You should be able to contribute on company time. So what you can do as a startup founder or employee, you can, instead of your employees feeling guilty about spending company time on open source, you should in fact encourage it by having systems of accountability and time management. You can say, you get to do these many hours every week on open source. Really simple. And then one pet peeve of mine, not a big problem, is a lot of companies make you have a separate open source GitHub account and a work GitHub account. I find that really annoying. We use GitHub Enterprise as well. You don't actually have to do that, no matter what they say. And I think having the same account is almost like a change in mindset, that you embrace and recognize contributions. People who contribute to open source projects can champion open source at your organization because you would see all of their contributions on their profile. And on the other hand, all the people who look at their public GitHub profile will also see all the work they've been doing in their private repository if they want. So what would be an MVP, right? In startup lingo, MVP is a minimum viable product where you don't have to do a lot of work, but you can quickly validate an idea. So I think an MVP is an internal sponsors fund. It's really simple to set up. We do it at Fabio. It can be really small. You can say, $100 for each employee in your company, and they get to spend it however they want on GitHub sponsors. I think this solves a really interesting problem because usually the top management does not understand the importance of open source on top of which their business is built, but the developers who are writing the code know it much better. So what if we could encourage developers to fund open source projects directly, but using company money? So at Fabio, we do it like this. We just give a budget with a company card to everyone, and we ask our employees to vote on what are the projects that we as a company should sponsor, and we also give them a budget on sponsoring stuff from their personal account. That's really fun because then they also get the little, oh yeah, I'm sponsoring all of these projects myself pride. And they don't have to, if you do 20 projects, $10 a month, they don't have to find $200 from their own paycheck to pay for it. I think also as a company, you have a vested interest that you can have no single point of failure in your upstream dependencies. So, for example, we remember what happened to like UA parser or all the stuff that happened related to that. You can align your incentives with maintainers by sponsoring them, right? It makes a lot of sense. Maintainers would be incentivized to fix security bugs or report vulnerabilities faster if they get paid to work on it. And you, as a company, realize that this is better for you. You're actually investing that money so that your code base is better. And then lastly, for Fabio, I found this in the wild, and I find it really cool. It's a really nice hiring perk, right? On our hiring Notion, we say, you get a new laptop and you get whatever developer education courses, but also we have a GitHub sponsors fund. So people bring this up constantly in interviews, that I love the fact that I can sponsor people on GitHub as an employee at this company. So I think it's really easy to set up an open source strategy at your company, and you would realize that it has a lot of impact, not just on the open source ecosystem, but also on your core business. Lastly, I love championing the idea of maintainer to founder. So I think if you're maintainers, I encourage you to take the plunge. Starting an open source company is really cool these days. Open source, I think, is swinging back around, right? Like, if you think about it, we had the days of like the Free Software Foundation, and then we had almost a valley of not great stuff happening. But then today we have large publicly traded institutions that are built on open source. Not just Red Hat, but also like Mongo and Elastic, right? Like modern companies. And some of my favorite ones are here, like Swix, which does open source webhooks, or Growthbook, which does open source A/B testing. People are building on top of this. And I think a really cool example is Microsoft, right? In the 90s, Microsoft, like, imagine, is the evil company, right? This antitrust lawsuits, and nobody likes open source, and everything is proprietary. And then fast forward to today, Microsoft is the most important company on earth in the open source ecosystem, right? Like, for me personally, everything that I do all day is NPM and GitHub, and I write TypeScript and VS Code, and it's all Microsoft. And then now it's also Actions and Copilot and all of this great stuff happening that we've heard about this morning. So I think this is strong validation that open source is swinging back around, and this is the exact right time to get started. I think personally, open source companies are really the best of both worlds, and there's a lot of ways to do this now. For example, SourceGraph, which is an open source code search company, they do dual licensing. So it's an MIT licensed repository, meaning it's really open source, like free as in freedom, and you can do whatever you want with it. But they have a little folder in the GitHub repository called Enterprise, and they say any code that's in this folder is in our Enterprise license. So companies that need all of those extra features can pay for it. This is called dual licensing. There's also delayed licensing, where you can, for example, put stuff in a proprietary license now, but then make it open source later. So there's a lot of cool ways to get started. I also like Nest.js, which is a TypeScript backend framework that does sponsorware and a lot of consulting and support. So as a maintainer, you can sell your time, and you can say, I will sign an SLA, and I will give you guaranteed 1 hour of support every month so that I can help you fix problems with using my tools and get paid for it. And lastly, I think fundraising has become accessible than ever, right? Like, there are VC funds now that fund exclusively in open source, and also traditional venture capital is now investing in open source as well. And like we saw Remix acquired by Shopify last week, but also like all of the great stuff that's happening in the JavaScript ecosystem, like Bun and Dino, are all venture funded. And one of my favorite companies is SourceGraph, which was started by people from my university as an open source project, and then raised millions of dollars. So I think if you're looking at the venture side and fast accelerated growth, now is also the exact right time to take your open source project and then build a business on top of it. If you're kind of more interested in this topic, especially around licensing, because that could be a bit intimidating when you're getting started with how do I build a business but also have a strong open source license, I recommend this book written by my friend Heather. It's called Open Source for Business. And I wish you the best of luck with setting up open source at your organization. So just to quickly summarize, right? So I have these two stories from making an open source project to a company, and then starting a company, and then realizing that I can build open source in there. And I think the best of both worlds these days is to build an open source company. So keep building, keep shipping, and I'm always here if you have questions. Thank you so much. Enjoy Universe.